Hello and welcome to the official podcast of the Georgia Game Developers Association. The following is part of a series of recordings made during the 2012 Southern Interactive Entertainment and Game Expo. In this episode, when will sports games get some design respect? Keynote speaker, Richard Hilleman. As the number of players grow in the world of video games, they are increasingly interested in different games and different subjects. As the games business expands beyond the traditional audience, sports becomes a more and more important part of the business. This shouldn't be a surprise. Sports created the modern video game business, and while it was at it, changed the political map of the world forever. The Georgia Game Developers Association now presents Richard Hilleman.
I'll do my best to be heard here, so if I can't be heard, let me know. For those of you hiding behind the screens, I'm sorry. You can move or you can pretend it's not there. One of them. So thanks for having me. I've never been to see it before. My friend Michael John, I think he'd spoken here before. He strongly recommended it. I come spend some time with you guys, and it sounded like a lot of fun, so I thought I'd do that. As you know, my name is Richard Hilleman. I'm Chief Creative Director for Electronic Arts. I've been there for a really long time, probably longer than many people who have been around. I've been at EA for 27 years. So that means I've done a lot of different things in my career. The very first game that I produced cost $22,000 and had one guy work on it for 4 months. And sold about 25,000 units. So pretty good ratio, actually, at the time. Today, obviously, those things are quite different, and I do a range of things. I work in an office called the Office of the Chief Creative Officer. We really worry about platforms, products, and people. This is really a lot about the people part. I will usually teach. The folks in my group will teach about 20 classes a year at major universities. I also do some high school teaching. I've done that this year already. So that's something we spend a lot of time. We also spend a lot of time on platforms, the new platforms that are coming out, things like the Wii U that you've heard of. But things you probably don't think about as platforms, things like Flash, HTML5, and other things that are emerging in that space. And then the final thing that we do is we spend a little bit of time on the product. We're essentially the firefighting group at Electronic Arts, and so if something catches on fire, we're usually sent to go work on it, or if just something is worth the trouble. So this year we spent a lot of time on Battlefield 3 and Star Wars and Sim Social, and at least the good news about that is all those are well worth the trouble. So that's kind of where I come from. I'm most famous in this business for being the guy who designed Madden Football. And that's thank you. And it makes me a little different than the average game designer. Most game designers that are in this business come out of really a strong affection for video games or for board games. And I really didn't come from that space. I like some board games. I'm actually, at one time in my life, I was a good enough chess player to letter in chess, not something you usually brag about. It's good for my nerd credentials. But at the same time, I lettered in chess. I also lettered in baseball the same year, so I tried to offset the two. What my perspective on game design as a result actually has really come much more from sports than it has been from the traditional games that you guys come from. And I've always felt like kind of the bastard stepchild of the business as a result. So what I'd like to do is try and make the case today, for the first time that I've ever tried to, why sports doesn't get any respect and why maybe it's time to give it some. And mostly it has to do with how the business is changing and how new people are coming into the business from a game player standpoint to what they look like. So we'll try and talk about that. I've got 40, 45, maybe 50 minutes of stuff depending on how much digression I see. And then I've got lots of time for questions at the end. I really like doing questions, so try and get me in trouble for that. So anyway, why doesn't sports games get any respect? For the most part, when I talk to game designers, they really don't think it matters very much. They don't think that we push the technology the way that shooters do. Hasn't somebody already designed that game? That's kind of the number one thing. And then if you do it every year, how hard can it be? Those seem to be the most common things that I hear. I've come to believe that a lot of it has to do with this problem, that most of you were stuck in a lockdown. So as a result, you don't really think very much of sports or the people who play sports games. And I understand that. I've kind of on both sides of that equation, so I do understand what that is. But I'd make the case that actually without sports, you wouldn't have video games today. I'll make that case more strongly as the day goes on. In the time that I worked on sports products, the kind of modern sports era of the 1990s till now, sports have been a lead product on every new platform that's launched since then. every single one, we've been one of the first 5 products on that platform. And one of the reasons that's possible is because sports are highly adaptable platforms. But one of the other reasons why is there's always interest. Every new platform uses sports to sell their new opportunities and really use it to define themselves. And so we've really spent a lot of time on that. The other thing that I think is important to understand is that when sports entered the video game business, that roughly there were 12,000 Genesises in the business, and there were about 22 million VCSs, and that was about it. And those numbers today are 4.5 times that size. And so, I make the case that sports had something to do with broadening the appeal of our game. The simple facts are the 90s, that there were a fair amount of video games played inside of fraternities in America, and it wasn't Super Mario. So the answer is that I think we've dramatically broadened the appeal of the video game business. Finally, I'm going to tell you a little story at the end where I actually believe the video game business as we know it was created by sport, and that we wouldn't be here without it. We'll talk about that in the end. So I think that you can learn a lot of things about sports. Number one is sports have to be accessible. You drop a ball on the ground between 5 kids, and they know what to do with it. They're making up games on the way. They're playing soccer. They're figuring out how to turn it into some other game that they can create on the fly at that point in time. If there's anything more fundamentally accessible than sports, I'm not sure I know what it is. The second thing is sports has made a business about teaching people how to play their games. We are lousy about that. There are whole institutions, universities that are devoted to teaching people how to play basketball. There is no university course to teach us how to play Mario, and there probably should be. But the point here is at the bottom of that is sports understand that it is fundamentally their job to teach you how to have more fun playing their game. And they never lose track of that under any set of circumstances. One of the things that sports does a great job of doing is mining the context out there. That's why we pay the licensing fees that we do. People know what sports is. People understand the inherent drama. They understand what's going to be presented at different points of time. They understand the rhythm of it the same way that they understand literature. And that's extremely important because it makes my job easier. Those are not moments I have to create. They're just moments I have to mine. In fact, I can just suggest them to you and they play in your heads. So that makes it an extraordinarily valuable tool for me to get really deep emotional context across. One of the things that sports has always done a great job is establishing a vision for excellence. So sports always is ranking you versus somebody else, ranking you versus your own capabilities, in the case of golf, or ranking you versus other players. They're constantly giving you the sense of what excellence is. Sometimes that's true in video games. Obviously, high score ladders do a good job of that in some cases. But when you're 7,741st on one of those ladders, what have you really learned? Not very much. Sports never gives you that kind of feedback. It's always feedback relative to somebody, and you always understand that delta. They've always been very good at that. Celebrating success is one of the things that the business is finally starting to get better at. But in a lot of times, I remember finishing, I think it was Bard's Tale 1, which we built. And at the end of Bard's Tale 1, you finished killed the last guy, and the Bard played for Scarborough, and then the screen went black, literally black. The end of the game was a black screen. There was no celebration of success going on there at all. That's a complete misunderstanding of what we've done. I've just taken some guy through 22 hours of torture, and all I can give him at the end is a black screen. It's not really fair. The last thing is a little trick that I have seen too often. In particular in the single-player game business, designers feel like it's their job to compete with the player. And I just don't get it. Nobody who is involved in a sport ever feels like that's the case. Yes, my job as a sports player is to compete with the player, but my job as a referee is to make sure that the best possible game is happening for everybody involved. We too often take the role in single-player games of being the other player and not the referee. We're not the ones who are facilitating the best possible gameplay. We're not spending our time on trying to figure out how to make sure the player's having fun. We're trying to make sure that they don't progress too fast in the game and finish it in 17 minutes so they feel like they got ripped off. We've got to start taking that more seriously. Stop competing with the player and start taking their success, their happiness as seriously as we take ours. Sports can make your current game players better. They follow a kind of standard development program. So, how you learn at football is you go out and you learn the technique for your position, and then you learn how to do it as a team, and then you learn how to put it in a strategic context. And there's something that makes you able to do that. It's called football practice. For the most part, everything you need to learn about educating or teaching somebody a game is taught in football practice. We need to make that part of what we do a little bit more serious and a little bit more over. The greatest games, I would make the case. Here's a good question: who's the best game designer ever? Who's the double? How about Miyamoto? Is that one a good one? So Shigeru Miyamoto, I would make the case, is the best coach in video games. Nobody does a better job of teaching you exactly what you need to learn at exactly the time you need to know it. I would make the case that Miyamoto is actually a better coach than a video game designer. If you take most of these games apart, they're stolen elements from other games, and I can point out what they are. But what Miyamoto always does better is teaches you how to play those games better than anybody else. Doesn't matter if it's Mario Kart has been around a while. There have been kart racing games for about 20 years before those guys made one. Yes, he made a bunch of good choices about how the game is fed out, but he also made a bunch of good choices about how you went to play it. Mario is essentially Lode Runner. Lode Runner was a game that predated it by almost 5 years. None of you have ever heard of it. And at the bottom of it, very good, you've heard of it, congratulations. Rotor Bun lives. But at the bottom of that, what did Miyamoto add to it? He made a dramatic difference in how it was presented, how he rewarded the player, and a dramatic difference in how he taught the player how to play the game. So at the bottom, Miyamoto was really a coach. Finally, we build brand new game mechanics in our business. Difficult game mechanics, not kick up a ball and throw it game mechanics, but I got to do these 6 things in this exact right order for the right thing to happen. We do a great job of that, and we give them absolutely no help in figuring out how to do it. So my point is, sports in general has easier game mechanics at a technique basis than we have in our games, and yet they spend way more time than we do trying to make those players understand how to be played. We need to take that more seriously ourselves. So sports, I think, and games are really the true universal language. There are a lot of other ones that get a lot of benefit for this. People talk about food being a universal language. For me, it serves to divide. People talk about music being universal language. I think that those are people who don't travel in Asia, where they have a different scale than we do. So it's difficult for it to be the common language. But what you've seen is time after time that gaming really serves to connect. Now, yes, it provides competition, but I think it's had an absolutely fundamental effect on human relations. And in the 20th century in some pretty profound ways. Another fundamental thing is sports is fundamentally social. Sports does not work without another human being. Even if you're playing a quote-unquote single-player sport, you still usually want to be watched. So it doesn't matter if it's bocce ball or it doesn't matter if it's horseshoes. People want to compete, and it's fundamentally about the social interaction that goes on. What's great about a game on the Wii is not what's going on the screen, it's what's going on between the people that are standing in front of that screen. Sports always understood that. And there's absolutely no way to explain bowling, softball, curling, or horseshoes and why they exist except drinking or social value for the sport. So how can you tell the difference between a sport and a non-sport? So there are sports and there are avocations. So I always use softball and baseball to divide. So how can you tell the difference between a sport and a non-sport? That's one way. I have a very simple one. Can you play that sport with a beer in your hand? I have played in softball leagues where the beer went out in the field. And if you hit the ball and it hit the beer, you were out. That tells me that in softball, the beer is more important than the ball. And I think that also tells you that it's fundamentally a social activity. Bowling, yes, there are great bowlers out there, but people do not bowl because they're great bowlers. They bowl because it's an excuse to gossip and drink beer. And those are good reasons. Those are good fundamental reasons. That means that sports by nature tells people this is an excuse to socially engage. We don't naturally build those games. That's why the Wii was such a transformative moment for the business, because we started to take much more seriously those interactions that took place on this side of the screen. So fundamentally, sports is a social context and has a whole bunch of that stuff you don't need to post. Plus it's got that. Finally, sports changes sports. Boy, that ended up a lot smaller than I thought. But anyway, so in my lifetime, I've seen 3 different times where I think that video games have perceived the way that sports perceived and played. So first of all, when I first started making video games, when I first started making Madden Football, I made it on the Genesis. And who remembers? At that particular time, when sports was on television, when they put a scoreboard on the screen, it was like 3/4 of the screen. That's like a whole damn screen with the scoreboard. And it was like, I know why they did it, because everybody's watching on 9-inch television. But by the time I got there, those 9-inch televisions were gone. So one of the things I did was I wanted all that screen area back, because I wanted to be able to put players on it. Frankly, I don't want to put players underneath my screen, so I put a little tiny scoreboard on the top. The next year, Fox put it on their NFL coverage. The next year. 2 years later, we had the yellow line on where our first down marker was. Lo and behold, 2 years later, what shows up in the NFL broadcast? Exactly that. I think maybe the most kind of obvious one was in 2009. There was an NFL game, and they threw an interception. Denver Broncos threw an interception to that. I don't know, 8 or 10 seconds left in the game. And the guy who intercepted the ball ran it all the way back for a touchdown. Except when he got to the goal line, he turned right and ran the entire length of the field right, because there was 5, 4, 3, 2 seconds left, and then he went in for the touchdown at the 2-second mark because he was about to be attacked. Where the hell did he learn that from? No coach told him that, trust me. Anybody who's played Madden and tried to run out the clock on a guy who can always score with 6 seconds left knows this, especially when he knows how to do an onside kick. So the point is, clearly this guy didn't want to give up that onside kick in the next game. So what I'm pointing out is Madden, just in its little tiny history of one game, I can point out 3 occurrences where I can directly show how we changed how the game is broadcast and published. Isn't that the kind of effect you want to have on the world? Don't you have that kind of ambition? So finally, I don't know a more consistent chart performance for the last 20 years in the sports business. And I'd be up for anybody that you guys would think of, but here's my kind of evidence. So step number 1, I'm just going to do a few years here. This is 2006. This is a week in 2006. This is the worldwide chart of units sold that week. What's in common? Oh yeah, they're all the same game. 2007, okay, one of them is not the same game, but what game is it? Wii Sports. I think that's a sports game. Let's see. The next year, we're a little more spread out. We have some Madden in there, but we also have a couple of other games. There is actually one non-sport game in there at that time.
That game sold.
For a week. Apparently 120,000 units or so. And then finally in 2009, we actually had sports all over the place. So what I make the case, by the way, this holds up, you go back 20 years and this is true every year. So every August and September, the #1 products in the country are sports products. They're either Madden, NHL, or FIFA, every year. That's an audience that shows up every year. Now what's the advantages of that? 2010, once again. So what do you get out of that consistency? The quickest and best way to learn your design skills is to iterate. The ability to do something over and over again and have an audience touch that product and tell you what you've done wrong, that's what makes you a better game designer. Doing it, getting feedback, changing it, and doing it again. Number 1. Number 2 is we have a deep and long history of telemetry within our sports products. So a game like Madden throws out something on the order of a couple of terabytes of data a year. That's pretty much every click you've made, every decision that was made in the product. That means that we have great detailed information about what customers actually do. And what we have found is everything we thought was true is wrong. Telemetry always tells you your customers are much more interesting, much more sophisticated, much more challenging than you ever thought they were. What we get out of this is the chance to, on a year-by-year basis, to get that telemetry, to get that feedback from our customers, to make those changes and to discover what really matters for the game. Very few other products get that annualized iteration cycle to do that. If you want to be a great game designer, you want iteration. Finally, that annualized audience is a gift. Often when you go to talk to people about your game, if they haven't played the whole game, they don't understand what you're asking. You'll tell them how good is the gameplay, and they'll tell you the graphics are lousy. They don't know how to articulate or talk about that game. We do not have that problem with Madden. People are very particular about what they like and don't like about Madden within each of the categories of the customers that we have. And as a result, we have a very clear understanding of what they want. That doesn't mean we're always able to do it, but we have a very clear communication path with our customers, and we are not confused. Finally, because we have so many customers and so often do they see us iterate, they can also tell when we're not doing well. So anybody who hasn't paid attention, Madden is among the most toughly reviewed products on an annualized basis you will ever see. We are hard pressed to get into the 80s. And you look at it, The Metacritic will have 300 reviews underneath it, and the forums will have another 5,000. And those people are very specific about what they like and don't like about it. For us, that's a real blessing, because it means that what we're hearing from our users, we understand and they mean what they say. That makes it possible for us to improve. So if you're trying to learn game design, one of the cases I make to you is that sports is a good place to do it, because you get those great feedback systems and they're so transparent and relevant. Now, so this audience is kind of interesting because you need to think in terms of how they think about sports. And this is probably the most important thing I'm going to tell you about sports design today. Sports design is not about simulating the game. That is a failure state. If I make you play football the way real football is played, how many of you in this room are professional football players? Congratulations. You won $6 from him last night playing Madden. So anyway, what I would say is that playing professional football is difficult. If you've ever been on a football field and had somebody running at you when you have a ball in your hand, trust me, you do not see the world as clearly as it looks like on the Madden Football screen. That is not what it looks like at all. We have to present to you something that you imagine playing football is like. How do most people discover and know football today? Television. So Madden looks a lot like television. Fundamentally, what you're doing is you're fulfilling their fantasy of what they think the sport is like, not what the sport is really like. We obviously try and do as much of that detail as we can, but fundamentally, players have to be able to play the game, and if you make it too hard, they can't. I can tell you a story about a different product. So the very first product I ever produced is a product called Chuck Yeager's Flight Trainer, which had which had the distinction of knocking off Microsoft Flight Simulator to the #1 spot on the IBM charts for a whole year. Bad news is when the first product you ever do is the #1 product, where do you have to go from there? So that was my challenge. We built a number of simulators after that, including very extensive F-16 simulators. Anybody ever play F-16 Combat Pilot or Falcon? If you remember, I think that was a 230-page manual. Pretty big manual. A real F-16, I've actually flown a real F-16 simulator at Williams Air Force Base. To fire a real AM-9 Sidewinder missile off of that takes 11 steps, including a bunch of shit with a radar screen that I don't even want to think about. So if and when we did, we built very precise, exact simulations, and we put them out there, and guess what? Nobody hit them. How do I fire the missile? That's because, from their perception, it isn't what a real F-16 pilot is. They don't want to be Tom Cruise. They want to get in the plane, they want to point it at the guy they want to shoot down, they want to pull the trigger, and they want him to blow up. That's their fantasy of what they think it's like. And if I tell them what it's really like, I'm just arguing with them. I find arguing with customers is a bad plan. So, in this particular case, what I would put at the bottom of that is the reason that sports games are a design challenge is because everybody thinks they know what they are, and they're all wrong. And when that's true, imagine how hard the design problem is, because I basically have to figure out how to square the reality with their fantasy. That's quite a design problem. Anybody who doesn't think it is, give it a whirl. So from my perspective, there are some good fundamental things you can learn about managing the fantasies of your players, not just about guys in tights or guys with lightsabers, but the other fantasies that people are having, and fulfilling those fantasies the way that they perceive them, not the way you wish they were. So how does this help? I think sports exercises the skills that you'll need for the future. And it just has turned out that the world is evolving to something that looks a lot more like the sports customer base. The three biggest changes in this business in the last 5 years that I've seen are who's playing, where they're playing, and how they're playing, and how they're paying. So first of all, we had a bunch of new players. So, as I talked about it before, generally the console hardcore business today, the high definition console business, is about 100 million installed units on a worldwide basis. Something like 65 million of those or so are probably active. That's PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 products. On iOS today, that's the Apple iOS, that's about 100 million installed devices today. On Android, it's about 100 million also. So those two segments together are already bigger, twice as big, than the current console businesses. On top of that, we've got 750 million Facebook players. These are all new mass market players. They did not grow up playing Ultima. They did not grow up playing Wizardry. They do not know what Mass Effect 3 is. And they probably never will. What they do know is they know what they know and they know what they like. These are the new customers that have come into my business. They make up 90% of the current gaming market. 90%. So although I am very interested in my console players and will continue to make products for them, I really like these guys because I've been waiting for 25 years for them to show up. So I'm not going to let them go. The other thing that's kind of interesting about them is how they behave. Their engagement level looks very much the same as our traditional customers. They may not play a mobile game for 2 hours at a stretch, but if you look at their weekly or monthly numbers, they look very similar to console play in time. The frequency is different, the granularity is different, but the totals are very similar. The other thing that's changed for this audience that's fundamentally different that I think is an important distinction for you to understand. So we have lots of people in the room who own consoles. Everybody raise their hands. Okay. Generally in that world, you picked a religion. You're a PlayStation guy, you're an Xbox guy, you're a Nintendo guy. There are a few of us who have too much money to have them all. But that makes us a heretic for all the time. We would happily live within our little walled gardens. Happy to be under the protection of the giant, because the giant will take good care of us. Almost all of these new players don't live in that world. They play at whatever device it is that they have, and they play the game that is on that device. So how you compete for their time, they don't put aside 2 hours a day to sit on a couch and play a video game, but they will set aside 25 seconds 100 times that day to play Angry Birds, because they'll fit it into their lives. It's not an appointment activity. Now, are they a game player? No. You ask them if they're a gamer, they will say no, because what they picture is the kid sitting on the couch who has less than complete control of his biological function. Surrounded by way too much wasted food matter. And hasn't apparently figured out how to utter 3 words in a coherent sentence in about a week. They don't want to be that guy. So they de-identify themselves as a gamer. But all of their behavior proves otherwise. They want the game where they want it when they want it. So that means you got to run on their browser, it means you got to run on their phone, it means you got to run on whatever other device they have. And any of those devices that you give up to them is a potential opportunity to lose that customer. This is a big change. Those customers don't align themselves based on the platform, they align themselves based on their communities of interest. And one of those big communities of interest is sports. When you look at the time that they spend, it is striking how close they get to console. So these console times look like something on the order of 12 hours a week for our current console players. These numbers are strikingly close in many cases to what they're well within the standard deviation of our console players. So what I'm telling you is they really actually are game players. They just don't want to be caught. So I want to talk about the kind of next thing to understand, which is they found new places to play. I'm fairly sure that if we could install consoles in bathrooms today, nobody would ever come out. But what they've all found is, in truth, there is the answer to bathroom gaming, and it's called the cell phone. So the next time one of you is at your parents' house and he takes a little too long in the bathroom, ask him if you brought a cell phone with him. And if he says yes, you can just smile and nod knowingly. We think as much as 25% of mobile gaming may occur in the bathroom. That's not a customer you're used to. Something else to think about is once I've gotten on a mobile device, what's the context on that mobile device? And if you look, this is Verizon, that's Sprint, and that's Vodafone, which is a large European cell phone. All of them spend their first dollar on marketing on sports. Our friends at Sprint spent 75% of their marketing budget on NASCAR. If you want to reach mass audiences on mobile devices, go to where the marketing works. Guess what that marketing turns out to be? It turns out to be sports. Funny thing. So my humble opinion is that it's time for you guys to start adapting and being interested in sports markets, because the more we head to the mass market, the more it looks like. Finally, the other big way that our business is changing is the way people play, the way people pay. So Who in here has Angry Birds? Go up. Come on. I don't believe it. How many of you paid for it? Well, that's a pretty good number. Actually, a way higher number than I would normally see. We think their sales rate is about 6%, which is pretty good for them. In the average freemium model right now, we operate at about 10% of customers we expect to pay in some way, shape, or form. So that's quite a big difference in the way things used to be. We used to get people to pay us on the way in the door. And that changed our businesses in pretty fundamental ways. It made us really focus on big launches. It made us focus on the value that we delivered at the beginning and how the big splash and boom that we could make out of that. But really, the new payment method really looks a lot like this, trying to get people on their way out the door. And that means that I've got to deliver continuing value. One of the things that's great about sports is it is in the business of continuing value. You know, what people do is they end up they're interested in what's going to happen this week. They will talk endlessly about the ankle of some 360-pound guy who they didn't know his name 2 weeks ago. And then next week they will forget his name and talk about some other 350-pound guy's other ankle. But, you know, clearly what's going on in this case is these people are contextually involved in sports all the time. That means that every one of the times they think about it is an opportunity for me to get them to pay. And I don't have to create the context that they operate in. In the space where you expect people to pay you after the fact, figuring out how to be a part of their life, not just because of your game, but have other cues in their environment will have everything to do with the money. So those new players, they look like a lot of the rest of the real world. They look like sports fans. And sports fans are a core monetization community, well aggregated and self-identified. Those are exactly the things you're looking for if you're trying to build a social game. It's how do I aggregate these customers? How do I monetize them? And how do I identify them? And sports customers do that for you. They fundamentally do the social marketing component for you. So if you figure out how to take advantage of that, you can see a big win. Where do you guys believe is probably ground zero for online gaming in the world? Where do we think the most innovation is today? Huh? Where? Facebook. That's a good example. I would say as a location. So is there a place in the world that we think is more on the front edge of online gaming? Huh?
Stadiums.
Stadiums. I was going to say Korea. The reason I'm saying Korea is because they have one of the most vibrant online communities that there are, very much based on the PC gaming platform there. We have had the #2 product in their space for the last 5 years, and it's been FIFA. FIFA just dominates that market like nobody other. Everybody around us has changed. Everybody else in those charts has changed over those 5 years, and we've stayed the same. Now, a lot of it is because it's a rich opportunity to add players to teams. All of the microtransaction elements are all there, including some that are pretty funny. So, anybody been to Korea here? Anybody played a game in an IGR? Well, I'm going to tell you a little story. So I did discover about universal languages that there are some other universal languages that work in places I didn't expect. One of the things that you can do in FIFA Online in Korea is that it's a game with wear. So your players, if you played yesterday and somebody got hurt, they're not going to play as well today. But I will, for a small application of a few won, I will sell you a brace that will fully repair that guy's knee and he will come back to 100%. Now, the guy that you're playing today can also pay me a few won to take that brace off. And then that guy can also pay to put it back on. And then another guy can pay to take it back off. So I sat in IGR and watched 2 guys do this for about 10 minutes, followed by the last guy giving up. I think there's a little context there. What do you think? So, from my perspective, what you see there is that's a really rich gaming experience. Clearly, it's a full online. Yes, I'm very proud that we made all that money from them paying us to do things that I do. Yes, I'm very proud. At the end of the day, that social motivation was fundamentally there. I didn't have to inject it. They had it already. Finally, new places to play. Sports technologies generally lead these technology choices in big ways. This is one example. The way that Verizon has broadcast football on it, the way that the NBA is broadcast on AT&T, the way NASCAR has been broadcast on top of the Verizon system, or top of the Sprint system, and the way Formula One is broadcast by Vodafone. Those are state-of-the-art applications of mobile technology. Nothing is pushing as hard. I spent a little time on the Indianapolis Motor Speedway's new car committee this year, which is an odd thing for me. That's what happens when they think you're a sports guy. Okay? So you get invited to do other things. They're trying to figure out how to be able to have wireless communication for 600,000 people simultaneously within about a 2-mile square space. That's a technical problem, gentlemen. Let me tell you, you just do the bandwidth math and it doesn't work. You are very hard pressed just to solve the laws of physics. Sports pushes this kind of technology like nobody else's business. The minute we get out of our living room, sports becomes more important. And so fundamentally, they're driving the way that fans should come. Finally, there are innovations in our space that have been fundamentally driving innovations outside of that. So our Madden line, our basketball line, our soccer line, our hockey line have a fundamental animation system they call ANT, A-I-N-T. And what that is it's integrated animation, physics, and AI package so that all of those choices, so the animations look good. The new version of Battlefield 3, its animation system came from sport. And the first time that you see a guy come running out from behind his face, he will scare the crap out of you because he looks real like you cannot believe it. It's all about how he moves, not about how it's shaped. And when he slams his back against a wall for cover, and you can feel from across the room him hitting that. That's why ANT is the source of that innovation. Finally, I'm going to use a term called metagame. Anybody know what I mean by metagame? Basically, it means the ability to play one game, multiple places, multiple platforms. Sports really is driving that. Some of it has the gift of golf. So golf has a unique characteristic in the area of sports for online play. We did our first online video game contest for money in 1995. It was a golf game. In 1998, we did a PGA Tour sanctioned 5 events where, in fact, the last round was played on the 18th hole of the PGA Tour event that year. What's great about golf is that it's basically one shot about every 3 minutes, and that shot takes up about 6 bytes of real data if I send it over the line. So it's really set up for mobile, it's set up for low bandwidth, and as a result, it's really set up for metagaming because I can have a phone, a browser-based experience, a console-based experience, and they can be one thing. I can start the game on my phone, play the 3rd hole, log on to my browser, play it there to the 5th hole, go home and finish it on my console. That's possible today, and we have been doing that. Sports has given us some of that opportunity because there are logical breakpoints in that, because it's got a structure that you understand, but mostly because it is so stingy with data that it really lets us manage most of it. So a new business model. Sports customers are already trained microtransaction customers. They spend endless little amounts of money. You put the average sports fan in a sports stadium with any money in their pocket, it is gone by the time they leave, and they buy shit they will never see again. How many of you walk around with foam fingers? I don't. And somebody will spend $19 to buy that foam finger that they will enjoy for 15 seconds. These customers are designed for microtransactions. They understand that. You don't need to explain to them why. They understand differential value and they add it on. Finally, in their lives, subscriptions and other ways of paying for the sport have been fundamental. So things like DirecTV have done a great job with Sunday Ticket and the other kinds of sports subscription services in teaching people that they're going to have a yearly residual value relationship with you, not just a one-off. So they both spread, and we both expanded the microtransaction model and the subscription model, the two extremes of the monetization models going forward. I'd also make the case that sports changes. And I went to China about 2 weeks ago, and I was doing some research. I've been asked to come and talk about games as a language. And that's kind of an interesting thing. I have to talk a little about that earlier. What I was kind of shocked to discover was I needed to understand China better, and so I tried to figure out how the U.S. and China's relationships happen. And I happened upon a piece of information that I had never understood before. So I'm going to make the case that sports was fundamentally responsible for changing our relationship, and in particular for creating the video games business in 1971. So, anybody know who these two guys are?
Ping pong players.
Who?
Ping pong players.
That's correct. So the guy with the long hair, I like that guy. His name's Glenn Cohen. Glenn Cohen was the 3-time U.S. junior table tennis champion, as they call it. And the guy on the left is a guy named Dwayne Dong. Dwayne was the 3-time world men's table tennis champion. Had won the championships in 65, 66, and 67, and then was not allowed to defend his title after that because China would not let them travel. These two guys met in a kind of odd way. So the World Championships of table tennis in 1971 were held in Nagano, Japan. And the U.S. team traveled, and the China team was the first time they were allowed to leave China to go to a national tournament since the Cultural Revolution started. Big deal. So Glenn Cohen's, he's hidden, he's not paying that much attention to what's going on. After the practice session is done for the U.S. team, he gets to goofing around and misses the bus. So he gets on the first bus that he sees, and it's the Chinese national table tennis team. This is quite a big deal. Well, he spots Dong and knows who he is, goes running back and sits down in his chair, and by the time they get to the hotel, the two of them have invited each other to come to China and the U.S. respectively. Of course, they didn't talk to anybody else about that, but they came up with that idea. So anyway, what I'm going to try and do is make the case to you that these two guys, this guy, anybody know who that is?
No.
Who?
No one but
No.
Ralph Baer.
Ralph Baer, very good. Ralph Baer is the true inventor of the video game business, and he has the patent to prove it. So, Ralph Baer is the inventor of the Magnavox, obviously. With a little help from these two guys. Joe and Lyon, Henry Kissinger. How they invented the modern video game business. So in 1971, I'm actually alive. In fact, I'm actually programming a computer already. It's that exact computer. It's a CDC 6400. I grew up in a place called Hopkins, Minnesota. That's where CDC is just down the street. Honeywell's computer corporate headquarters were there. I went to an elementary school that had a terminal with access to a computer, and it got me out of math class. I'm doing that. So all I had to do was roll into the little printout that showed I made a program that day that did something, and I could play all the games that were on that terminal that I wanted. So as I told you, these two guys ended up meeting in an odd place at an odd time in Nagano, Japan, and ended up driving to create this event where the U.S. table tennis team went to China and essentially opened the door to China. Those of you who weren't alive in 1971 probably don't know this, but we had 3 television networks then, kind of like half a dozen national newspapers. So the context, the news noise was at a different shape. It came from just a few sources and it was really loud. The U.S. went absolutely ping pong crazy. I mean, wacky things. So what you see in the middle is a top 5 hit that's a song about ping pong. I couldn't find it, and I think I was probably at Lesson. And that's the U.S. ping pong team sitting on the Great Wall of China. This was a big, big deal. Now, Brother Ralph at the same time has been working since 1968 on a video console, and he can't get arrested. This stuff, he could have had it in 1968. It could have gotten in the way of watching the movie. But instead, he's been working on this and working on it. And so they eventually developed something for Magnavox called the Odyssey. Some of you may have heard of that. They didn't just develop one game for it. At the time that Magnavox bought the asset from the folks who were building it, they had something on the order of 16 games. Anybody have any idea of what the game was that they shipped with that year? What was the packing game? Yes. That would be Pong. Why do you think that was chosen? Maybe it was because the U.S. was ping pong crazy. So what I'm making the case is, kind of, where would you guys be without a long-haired hippie ping pong player? You know it. The Chinese like this a lot because basically I gave them credit for inventing the modern video game business, which is something they try to figure out how to do about everything else. So I've given them the tools. For you, what I'm trying to tell you is that sports is a tool to help you understand game design and do it in unique ways. That your customers, especially the new customers that make up 90% of the game players out there, understand and engage in sports sometimes better than you do. And maybe it's time for you to learn a few of the lessons from them. But I do fundamentally believe that there are lots of new things that you can learn from sports design, and now's a good chance. Come compete against us. I'd actually like that. But most importantly, I'd like to be able to hire designers that understand sports games, because we pretty much have to make it ourselves. All right? So that's my little case. I'll make the case why without sports, you wouldn't be here today. I've now done my little defense of the sports game design genre, not that anybody else will, but I have today. And hopefully some of you maybe will look at sports games in your lives. That's awesome. Thanks for having me. I think we have some time for questions. Yes, sir. He's right on.
Sure.
Because he's the professional football player.
I had a question. You talked about earlier about how the Wii has, an extra environment where it's part of the game is communicating outside of it.
I think all the games communicate.
Right, yeah. So, but when you go to game shooters like Goldeneye, that was a big aspect of having 4 players talking to each other in the same couch. But now shooters are kind of going away from that. It's online a bit. Why is that game like Battlefield 3 and Modern Warfare are not having that co-op mode on one console? Is it technological reasons or design front reasons?
From what I can tell, what happened is Xbox Live changed the way that people think about multiplayer gaming. So people still play sports games on the same couch a lot, but shooters, for some reason, people want the screen context. And a lot of it is, I frankly think it has a lot to do with sniping. So the problem is I need the resolution to shoot you. I need to see you to shoot you at that range. And then once I split the screen in half, I cut my resolution effectively in half. So I personally, one of my all-time favorite things was to play the original Quake on the N64 in 2-player mode, battle axes only. What's great about that is you can look at their screen and you still can't figure out where they are. So the usual motif would be you go hide in a corner so your screen's completely black and then just watch the other guy. So that to me was nothing but sport. That looks, that whole behavior set, the social context, even how it gets resolved, how you kind of celebrate a little victory over the person, that is sports as context. I actually believe that first-person shooters are showing all the signs of being a sport, meaning you can watch somebody play the game, and by the individual choices they make, their individual expression within the game, tell who they are the same way you can in a sports event. I think are we got lots of people here. So I got one behind you first, okay? Go ahead.
Complete non sequitur, but along the lines of what he was talking about. Players on the same screen.
Yep.
Have I seen something regarding the stereoscopic displays and the fact that 2 people can sit on the same couch, looking at the same television screen, playing the same game and not being able to see each other's screen?
Yeah, and that's a trick that I believe there's a patent on, or somebody's filed a patent on. What it essentially does is give each guy 3D glasses with the same. So how 3D glasses work today is they have a lens that's polarized this way and a lens that's polarized that way. They give you a set that's polarized like that, and they give the other guy a set that's polarized like that. That way you only see your half of the screen and he sees his half of the screen. The bad news is it cuts frame rate. Yes, sir.
What sport do you think is currently most
Unserved?
Yeah, underserved or unserved?
We have some games that we are struggling with how to make them great. Basketball continues to be a problem for us, and the number one issue with basketball is rebounding. It's understanding how far the ball is going to come out to the backcourt. Basketball is the only sports game that I can think of, other than golf, that actually is going to get helped by 3D. My ability to understand that depth of rebound will be dramatically improved. Golf is going to be aided because I can finally be able to read the green. Sorry. So I got to get somebody on that side. Yes.
Which Madden game did you get the best reaction to, and which did you get the worst reaction to?
And there have been 20 of them. I think we've had many of those best reactions. Obviously, the 1990 game, we blew the house off, and 91 did just as well. I think the places where we made the biggest difference was the first time that we had 3D players on the PlayStation 1, which would be 97, I think, 96. And then I think the first 360 game, people were quite surprised by what that was.
And what about the worst?
I think the last 2D game we did on the PlayStation was a bad call. We should have changed to 3D faster on that product. That was when Mr. Orr was winning. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that designers need to be on some level of coaches, but in your section about what sports games should be, it seemed almost like you were making the argument that in order to be a great sport game designer, you need to be less of a game designer and more of a coach/broadcaster to be able to tap.
Now, I think being a game designer is about being a coach. I think that what you have to do is teach people how to play your game. And so my point is that in sports, that's just fundamentally built into the entire mechanism. People understand that's a job that has to be done. There's curriculum around it. People take it seriously. And somebody who's a great coach is not thought of less than somebody who's a great athlete. In our space, what happens is somebody who makes games that teach people how to play them, that feel like they're easy for some reason, have less virtue in our space. In other words, the harder the game, for some reason, the more credit the designer gets. That's competing with a player I don't understand. Did I answer your question?
I understand.
What do you think needs to happen with sports games on the Facebook platform for them to gain more traction?
It's already doing some of those things. So Superstar, the two Superstars games that we have, the NFL game and the FIFA game, are both do well. They're not 60 million user games, but they do pretty well. Facebook and in particular Google Plus, increasingly those platforms are going to be capable of doing almost anything we want. So I think it's much more a question about what we give people and when. But one of the things that I can do is take my very high-end, very high production value assets and produce video assets that play inside of Facebook to show you how to play results without having to run all that stuff locally. Sure. That's one of the opportunities we have. In general, the Facebook platform and the Google Plus platform are both improving to where I can put, relatively normal games on them and they will work. It's a question of whether or not customers will pay for them in a way that makes sense. Yes, sir.
Does EA have any particular strategy when it comes to, say, Facebook, where it's a free-to-play with dependency on microtransactions or so forth?
No, we don't have a strategy, but Facebook customers do. That's pretty much how they work. The Facebook customers don't want to pay at the door; they want to pay on the way out the door, and you have to kind of accept that model and work within it. The good news is, in a metagaming context, we have lots of other places to kind of get money out of them. So what they do on Facebook, I don't have to monetize everything there if I can monetize them someplace else. That's one of our real opportunities, I think, if people understand and expect that out of sports, kind of from day one. In other games, for some reason, it feels like some customers feel like they're being taken advantage of.
Well, I know in context of MMOs, they basically use a model that's basically pay to win.
Yeah.
And then some other games are actually transitioning to kind of stabilize the platform for free players as well as pay players.
Yeah, I think the challenge when you build a free-to-play game is how do you make it so that the differentials in that economy don't destroy you. For us, The Sims Online failed not because the gameplay wasn't good, because it failed because the economy failed. So most MMOs die of their economy failure, not of some external force. I think there's lots of interesting things going on in the MMO space right now around currency there may have an effect on that. But for the most part right now, we are dealing to the business models that our customers will give us. And what we count on is that if we can delight them, we get to keep them. Unlike most digital assets, customers are actually used to paying us for games. That is a blessing. The guys in the movie and music business aren't so lucky. Did I get you yet? Go.
I've been real big into Madden. I've probably been Madden since '96.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
But for me, that's something that I'm really interested in. How would I get into doing something that has to do with sports? I mean, like I'm literally a big sports fan as it is, but that's what I enjoy. You know what I mean? But how would I get into actually figuring out how to be able to start learning or finding someone that could actually teach me how y'all design sports games? That's what I want to do. That's what I want to do for my career.
So number one is one of the reasons I'm having this conversation today is it's time to spend time with the universities that are producing game designers and game producers to produce them in this space. And we'll spend some time and money to make that true. So one of those is, you'll see one of those programs someday real soon now. Probably, by the way, in the South, for what it's worth. Mostly because Tim runs down here. So that's step number one. Step number two, get some experience either being in the testing part of those businesses or in some other related business. So Madden, for instance, has people who serve as ambassadors on college campuses, and that's a way for you to get to know that crowd. Finally, show up at the doorstep and know who the starting running back is for Alabama that year, and know what the latest version of HTML5 is. It's not free browser. You really need to show up, because what they're going to do is they're going to put you in the dumb jock category until you prove my voice. Sorry. Terrible.
Why do you think some sports games get more credit than others? Because like a game like Forza or like one of the racing games, those are generally speaking
absolutely sports
technology.
Yeah.
But then other games just aren't.
I think Forza and GT probably even more so get a lot of credit for the graphics. And I don't think we actually spend enough time pounding our chest about that. In polygons per frame, for the shading that we use, for the camera systems that we use, we just don't pound our chest about it. And a lot of people don't give us credit for it. A lot of it is because they see it 5 times and it looks a lot less spectacular the first time they did it first. But some of it is we're just out all the time. Yes, sir.
Last week, the people at my university put signs on the vending machines saying that they no longer took credit cards because the credit card companies apparently raised the minimum fee as a result of the government regulation on the maximum fees.
Mostly it was about the debit fees, actually.
Could you say something about artificial economies and electronic arts sort of vision in those areas, possibly cross-industry or within your company?
So I got to make sure I'm answering their question here. So in that particular context, what you're talking about is the problem of how do I get paid by customers, and in particular. So the CEO of GameStop, and I've been in a couple of different places he's used this, they do 60% of their business in cash or cash equivalents. So credit cards actually are a problem. We're going to have a digital distribution future. We're going to have to solve the problem of getting paid by people who don't have credit cards or don't want to use credit cards for that transaction. And the bigger the audience gets, the more worldwide that audience gets, the more profound that problem gets. It creates all kinds of other interesting problems. So smaller countries get very nervous when we have artificial currencies that actually on a worldwide basis are bigger than their local currency. Countries get concerned about that for obvious reasons. I think Iceland all gave us a lesson what happens when your reserves are greater than your cash. That produces a certain interesting problem. I think the evolution of how people get paid in this space is going to be very interesting. In different markets, you see different approaches. The dominant form of this kind of transaction in China and Korea is cell phone. And they'll do a transaction with your cell phone, and it ends up on your cell phone account, or in most cases in Korea, parents actually give kids allowances on their cell phones. So that's one monetization model for that space. Obviously, that's designed to run in very small microtransaction iterations. The other way is the emergence of payment cards. And I think those are really important. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the regional sports games like cricket and rugby? I'm always fascinated.
Australian rules football.
Yeah, same. I'm fascinated that you do products in those countries, and especially when I think about cricket in India or soccer being global, a little less so. But
cricket is actually a better example of a social sport. For God's sakes, why would you sit for 4 hours and watch that? The only reason why is gym. That is why.
Are there other sports that you're seeing in regions coming up that you'd like to do that you haven't?
I think that we look at the internationals first, and we have some of those that have underperformed. For us, we just can't seem to get tennis to get arrested. I think it's actually a pretty good game, but it's just tennis is at a low ebb right now. Nobody cares about it. Nobody can name 2 tennis players, so that's a challenge for us. For rugby union, and for Australian rules football, the benefit of there was we were actually able to build 2 games essentially out of one tech. So that meant that I could make both of those markets, which neither one was justified by themselves, pay. And then cricket was an absolute freaking labor of love of one guy. He just had to do it, and he wouldn't stop us until he did it. I think we paid less than $1 million to do that project we did the first time. And when you figure out how to spend less money at it, you can figure out how to do better. That's one of the new opportunities that comes out of digital distribution. They no longer have to get $60 for something. I can get paid at a different price point. I can suddenly start to accommodate things. So somebody was asking, Olympic wrestling today. There's a part of me that would like to do Olympic wrestling. There's some technical problems with doing it today. Larry Probst is chairman of the board of Electronic Arts. He's also chairman of the U.S. Olympic Committee. Trust me, we talk all the time about all the other sports that they make. We are interested in other ones. Those micro kind of, what I would call micro territorial sales things are usually built on having a good marketing model in that space and having a good inexpensive technology model to get there.
Have you guys looked into a lacrosse game?
Into a lacrosse game. I did. When I built hockey, lacrosse and hockey are enough related that you can build one out of the other. Lacrosse at that point was purely a college game, and so it didn't cross over. And Major League Lacrosse has actually been pretty predatory about their licensing. It's kind of a shame. We could help them a lot. Let's see.
Here, and the more countries like Korea, the line between what is a sport and video game is really starting to blur. Yeah, and so I guess a couple questions. One, what is it about sports that gains the booms of all of what you're saying? Is it the culture, the pre-existing culture of sports, or is it something inherent about the sports themselves that change the audience? And what can games like, let's say, StarCraft in Korea do to make them cover sports games instead of games that people play as a sport?
So I think people decide what sports are, and I don't think anything I say matters. People kind of decide. What I think has made the difference for what you see in Korea, which is essentially things like StarCraft, is that people watch them because they care about who's playing. So the reason why a sport becomes a spectator sport, that's what we're talking about in this case, is because you care about who's playing and you're interested in the story that they're creating by playing that sport. So if you don't know who the two players are, if you can't recognize their gameplay style, if you can't articulate to somebody what makes that player different than somebody else, chances are it's not a sport. That ability to individually express yourself in that sport is what creates both your interest in that sport and creates the opportunity for a spectator to watch it. So I think it's that individual expression. When Kill Creek would play Thresh at Quake, absolutely sport. The two could invert their skins and I can tell you who's who in 15 seconds. So from my perspective, those have evolved into being sports because they've evolved into being individual expressions that you can recognize with an individual player playing the game at any point in time. The baseball example is, when I was a kid, everybody could do Carl Yastrzemski's batting stance. And we all would recognize it, we could recognize it in silhouette. That ability to recognize an individual player in a spectator sport is the definition of what makes it.
Do you attribute that to the game or the culture that forms around the game?
All of the above. So it's the spotlight that gets put on it. It's the fact that the game gives you enough space to express yourself. Generally, video games have much more rigid rules than sports do. Sports have referees to interpret rules, which is the bane of my existence, maybe built to design them. But that open space, that squishiness, is fundamental to making there something that people feel like they can individually express themselves. But the vast majority of sports that get played in America is participatory sports. It's two guys kicking a ball around the backyard, or two guys playing tennis who really don't know how to play tennis. Why are they doing that? It's completely about the other person on the side of the net. It has nothing to do with the equipment. Yes, sir.
With the introduction of like almost soccer, internet, what can you expect to see from experience?
Had to be. So Move and Connect have mattered a little less to those platforms than the Wii. You didn't have a choice. We had to throw the game that made sense on the Wii. There are things we liked about that. Motion control has a great ability to produce emotional contact for the player. Throwing something like this is a lot better than pressing the X button. It just is. What we have found is that essentially they operate like buttons at the end of the day. What you're doing is turning what used to be a button into a motion, and that becomes almost a vocabulary of itself. What we haven't seen is that any of those systems are precise enough to where you can produce kind of analog change in gameplay with them, at least not yet. Some of it is the processing that underlies, for instance, Connect steals so much away from my ability to do the rest of the game. It's a very high price. On Move, it's a bit of its fidelity is limited, although it's by far the best for doing golf games. And on the Wii, we have just some limitations about what that device can do. So we like motion control. Right now, it hasn't turned out to kind of see it. You still got to figure out how to make it. Yes, sir.
Why have major developers kind of avoided, community-based markets like MMOs? Like it's not because of the free-to-play, but just period. I haven't seen major companies go into that.
Being free-to-play?
No. Without free-to-play, I haven't seen major companies, developers go into MMOs at all, where it's community-based and guilds.
I think because Mike and Blizzard scared the crap out of me. So for what I know is I've spent the better part of the last 2 years trying to make sure that we've got Star Wars MMO that's ready to be competitive this year. So it's our intention to show up in that neighborhood and make some business happen. And it's quite a different MMO. You'll want to come back more often because there'll be more different content than you see in World of Warcraft. I think that the MMO business is extraordinarily important. It's about $350 to $400 million just to get in today's marketplace. There is obviously the Asian version of MMOs is quite different, but today the simple fact is I think there are exactly 2 companies who can afford to be in the MMO business, and they are.
From your perspective, what do you see as the future landscape of competitive esports in the U.S.? And also, what do you think are the top 3 reasons that it hasn't picked up faster than it has right now, like in Korea or Asia and
So
Europe?
you pick up that, say your first sentence again, I just.
I want you to, from your perspective, you give me what you think is the landscape or what competitive esports is going to look like 5, 10 years from now.
Okay.
Competitive esports, yeah.
I think that until you can get people to show up in person to watch people play video games like they do in Korea, that it doesn't go anywhere. So spectator sports work because they're entertainment. And to be entertained, people have to be willing to pay to show up.
And that requires a physical location to go to.
I think so. I think that sporting events are events. They're fundamentally social events. They're ways that you connect with other people, usually with a bunch of people who are thinking about the same thing you are. That is a very emotional piece of context for people. If you don't reproduce that, it is not the same as watching it. So, although some television sports, some sports really work well on television. Anybody been to an NFL game recently? This is terrible. Anything more boring than that? NFL games are like the most boring thing in the world. You're spending all your time waiting for the television commercials. So that's a good example where it's lost. You know, I recognize Atlanta lost their hockey team. My condolences. But anybody go to a hockey game in the last couple of years? Does that sport translate to television? I would say that sport does not translate to television. You do not get how big they are. You do not get how fast they go. And you do not get how hard that puck goes until you are there in person. And once you do, it changes your entire perception of that sport. So some of this is you got to get people to show up in person. You got to get them to have that emotional connection. And that's a big part of what's involved in making a spectator sport. Yes, sir.
On one side, you had shown like the different markets and how like console was actually one of the smaller ones.
But they pay well, so we love them more.
Yeah. In the future, where do you see like console? Do you think that will ever like dwindle out, or do you think there will always be that box which is referred to as the console?
I think console gaming today is what I would call an extreme experience on purpose. It's the most immersive possible game that you can get. There are the obviously most extreme PC gaming rigs are maybe on the other end of that. So it's like I can pay $600, I can spend $3,000. There's always a market for that most extreme expression, and I think that 50 million that we have today is that market. You know, there are people who will go spend $7,000 on a Macintosh 2-channel amplifier because it matters deeply to them how their music sounds. That's their lifestyle. That's their identification. So I think people who've identified themselves as lifetime console gamers, I don't think they're going away. I think what we've done is we've added a bunch of people who game on an incidental basis, and that as a result, they've just added to the crowd. We haven't lost it. Yes, sir.
A follow-up there is one of the things I see or worry, and I just want your thoughts, is kids. The kids only want to play with their parents' phone, play their games.
Well, we're the leading publisher for mobile phones, so we think that's okay.
But 18 years from now, they're not gonna. They don't pick the game, or they don't pick any other device.
That might be true. That's not what we're seeing. So it's okay. What it's hurting is it's hurting the DS, but it isn't hurting the console.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. I want to answer a question related. Yes. Let's see here. Every business transaction in China starts out with a real estate transaction. I learned that. I learned that I had 5 banquets in 3 days. That was a lot. I also learned that they're about to lift the outlaw on gaming consoles in China. I thought that was kind of interesting, but I'm not even sure I know why. But what it's done is it's got them fired up about video game consoles. Now, I had 2 different discussions with Chinese officials that maybe hinted me about why this might be true. They were extremely interested in the military applications of gaming consoles. So let me make my little case of maybe what's going on. So what is the U.S.'s current most effective military weapon? What?
Drones.
Predator drones, I make the case. Who flies Predator drones today?
Gamers.
It's enlisted men sitting in trailers outside of Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, Nevada. They go across the street, they have a hamburger and beer at lunch, and then they come back and bomb.
Higher rates of PTSD for those guys.
Yes, that's also true, unfortunately.
Even though they're not free.
The thing to understand is who trained them how to do that job? China has not had a video game console with a joystick in China for 10 years. This might be a problem. So you never thought you were strategic. You never thought that you were a national strategic asset, did you? Yes, sir.
How something do you think that's all popularity of games and how successful that we heard
I mean, why do they get that at? I think the real reason why is economics. So the problem is that console games are pretty expensive to make. Average about $20 million, some as high as $50 million to build. And then what costs money in that is time, mostly art. And so what happens is the time scale gets limited by that economics mostly. When some people have cut that back a lot, then the designer feels like it's his job to invent that 20-hour value coefficient. So what he does is he just punishes you at every turn. I think that what we see is the new business, the new consoles, the new places where the games are playing today. Plants vs. Zombies or Angry Birds is not going to kill me from a cost standpoint to build those games. What makes both of those games great is not the aesthetics, it's the fact that they spent 2.5 years making great play. So for us, what it does is those new platforms take away the crutch that is production values from us. You can't just hammer people with production values. We actually have to show them games to play. And I think that's a good thing. You know, I happen to be that part of the business. I think game designers matter, so I like it. Yes, sir. We've been typing furiously.
So, Capcom's latest fighting games, the Street Fighter ones, one of their published features is like being able to watch people play like matches, and I would imagine some people buy it more to watch other people play than to actually play themselves. Have you seen any interest in that in the games that you make, or not because they're based on real sports and they can watch the real thing?
So the year that we did the Tiger Woods tournament in 1999, 1998, one of the things we did that year was a Java viewer for the game, so that people could watch that last round at home. And that Java viewer at that time for a game that we had sold just slightly more than 600,000 users, we had more than 1 million downloads of the viewer. So apparently there are more people interested in watching than playing, at least when they're kids. Yes, sir.
I'd like to make a follow-up to that point about Korea. When we were in Korea, we saw at the movie theater advertisements for, I think it was either Madden or something else.
Probably FIFA.
It was played automatically at the movie theater, and the audience of young people would come and watch it autoplay and eat their popcorn and drink. It was massive.
Yep. For that culture, it has evolved into being a spectator sport. There's a sign of that in China. It's not nearly at the same depth. But you know, the places that have had that multiplayer culture with IGRs, it's a fundamental part of it.
What game are you targeting for China? What do you think?
What game will reach?
Yeah, what do you want? What do they want?
So the one they want the most is Sim Social.
Is it possible to develop the game on the cable and the TV?
Sorry, what?
Is it possible to develop games on the TV channels and cable?
Yes. So one of the things that I've worked on for the last 2.5 years is the streaming gaming business. Online, Guy, Otoy, Playcast, G-Cluster. I'm going to forget something.
I know some groups are trying 3D TV games.
So what's interesting is that 3D television, the processing power of a 3D television is approximately equivalent to a PlayStation 2. So that television already has graphics capacities that are pretty astounding if you figure out how to do it. What streaming gaming does is essentially put the CPU at one end of the wire and the graphics display unit in your living room. That is one of the ways that I think you're going to see what you're describing happen, which is it essentially can run on any device in your house. People are concerned about latency in that. I find that in practice not to really be a problem. Most of the places in the world, the ISPs that we're talking about, operate in regions that have less than 50 miles across them. The speed of play is not consequential for any of those circuits. So yeah, I think there's an opportunity there. I think that's part of this new audience is going to drive that, not the console players, because they want to be able to play, you know, they want to be able to play Farmville for 5 minutes on their television. I've got to go to him because I haven't asked him yet. Go ahead.
Two things. First, do you think the introduction of consoles in China will break the PC market or modify it? And second, is it kind of ironic that they manufacture all the games in the consoles but they still have never played?
Why, yes, it is. What I believe is that the Chinese video console business will be so fundamentally different than the US or European that it won't even matter. So they're going to build, I believe they'll build their own machine for the market because they want controls that, that the big three won't let them have. And that means that they'll have a very, quantity has a quality of its own. When you have 1.1 billion potential customers, you can evolve a market that's completely detached from ours and will never be a part of it. We're going to pay attention. We're going to try and be a part of it. But I would not be surprised if on a top 20 chart for China, there's only one title to recognize. And all the rest of them are selling 10 million copies a year. The biggest MMO in the world is Maple Story. And most of you have never played it. Sir.
You mentioned earlier in your talk on how players, gamers specifically, has that social stigma attached to it when it comes to those who are on the market of playing on their iPhone.
They don't want to self-identify themselves as a gamer.
Is there any way that you see that could change that, you having such a stigma?
Well, I think there are two ways. One of them is that the term gamer doesn't mean the guy with the Cheetos on the floor anymore. So one is to give that group a new term. And that may be the answer. The other answer is that they just get over it. And I think they'll just get over it. I think that it's, what I find is that when I tell people, I have telemetry for them. So when I go play ice hockey on Sunday morning, people tell me what they do, and I know what they do. People generally are much more, have that behavior style than they think. And when they come to terms with it, they kind of smirk about it and get over it. What I think is different, social games are a little bit different. One of the other places I grew up was Las Vegas, Nevada. And that means that I appreciate the other gaming business we're not talking about today a little bit. But fundamentally at the bottom of social games are a lot of principles to how slot machines are. And so what I think we're seeing is really an evolution of all of those skills that are blending in. All right, go. No, it's okay. We're back to repeat, so we'll do all Sure, spectators.
Like where it's like we go out and watch football.
So the Madden Bowl, when we do the Madden Bowl every year, we get 7,000 people who scream and yell and throw shit. So the answer is in that case because they care about the play. The answer is those are NFL players that they know who they are, and they have some emotional investment in them already. I think that's the key. We have generally, I want to make big generalizations here, but generally we're not the most social group. We're not that good at standing up in front of people and talking. We're not that good at interviews. We're not that good at building empathy with somebody who might be our fan. I think part of what we need to do is evolve our social skills. The good news is all of you are way better than people from my era were. People from my era spend way too much time in the bedrooms with the doors closed. At least you guys are spending time with other people. I think that's a big deal. Yes, sir.
The opposite end of coaching players out in your game, I was thinking maybe Demon Souls and Dark Souls would be extreme. For there's no real.
I don't know that game.
Well, it's a Japanese From Software game. Okay. And the selling point of it for a lot of players is that it's just incredibly difficult. And you play through it over and over again, dying over and over again, trying to figure out what to do. And the coaching kind of comes from other players.
Well, it sounds like the coaching is evolving because the designer forgot to give it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think I think those are bludgeon fests. I don't understand. I just think it's cruel. How we treat our customers sometimes, I just don't. If any other business did this, it would work. If you went to the gas station, put gas in your car, you had to do the things that we make you do, we wouldn't have an imported oil problem.
Yeah, earlier you talked about metagaming, being able to interact with the same game,
Yep.
same sort of
Playing one big game is close to a bunch of little.
Right. Can you sort of expand on that more? What are hallmarks of successful metagaming? What are lessons we can take from sports games on metagaming in other areas?
So metagaming, the magic of metagaming means that I'm playing the same game no matter where I am. That's the magic you have to produce. If you user doesn't believe that all those experiences are one thing to fit. Number one. Number two is when you run on multiple devices, you have to be device appropriate. Golf has a wonderful gift in that it doesn't care. I can literally play the same game mechanic on every machine. But for a shooter, I don't think that I want to play a shooter on my phone. On the other hand, I might play an application called Gunmaster. And what it does is lets me grind away at the accuracy, at the fire rate, and other characteristics of the weapons that I have, so I can take back those characteristics to the game when I play it. So the answer here is, from my perspective, you have to use devices appropriate to the granularity and frequency. Meaning it's got to fit the way I actually use that device. And I've got to integrate that in a way that makes sense with other games. It doesn't mean the game needs to be the same on all those platforms, but it needs to feel like you're playing one game. Does that make sense? Those are the two principles I think. Yes?
So speaking of metagaming and sports gaming, what's the intersection in the future of betting in sports video games? Because betting is, you mentioned drinking,
sure,
but you forgot betting.
I did forget. I did forget.
So where does that?
Obviously,
regulations aside.
So I think we're already there. I know of at least 2 professional gamers who use Madden as a tool. And I actually think today, if you have up-to-date player ratings, up-to-date players for Sundays, whoever you want to play on Sunday, if the playbooks are up-to-date, I think you can bet the over number.
So you're talking about using Madden as a tool for betting, but what about just the interface and layering on betting into, like as a social thing?
Right, there are a couple of European territories where we're able to do it, and we've tried it. It produces as many social problems, meaning it produces as many pissed off players as it does happy ones so far. And the net for me is not out. So my participation in the gaming part, almost all places don't let me run that business. And that means if I'm getting a piece of it and then what they're doing is causing me users, I'm not that thrilled about it. I do think it's interesting to make that, and our sports guys are always, the golf guys, I think it's happening anyway. I just think that it's changing hands on the couch. Yes, sir.
I've been a long time PC player, and over the years we've watched it transition to where the PC games have gone down in sales, consoles have taken off, now handhelds and phones and all those are taking off too. And as a diehard PC fan, I hate to see the PC go away because the experience is so much better, I think, than any other, although the console's getting closer. What do you think 5-10 years from now? Is the PC going to go away completely? Is the next generation of consoles going to become the PC? Are they going to eventually be playing against one another?
Today and for the next 3 years, the PC is the most important gaming console on the planet. It's the most played gaming console in the world today, by a mile. Think about it. The Chinese video game market is all PCs. There ain't nothing else there. There are big swaths. Korea is a dominantly PC market. There are at least 3 territories in Europe where the PC is the dominant market.
Why haven't we seen more of the PCs and consoles playing against each other out? And
that's the decision of the console makers, not the decision of the PC makers.
Would it be beneficial to you as a game developer to have?
I'd love to have it happen, and they so far have said no. I think we've done one other thing in the PC business, which is it has become only the hardest of the hardcore. So the machine requirements that we have right now for PC products invalidate 95% of the machines made. I think that's a problem. I don't know why that's happened. PC games never used to be like that. 75% of the machines produced now are laptops, and very few games are on laptops. I think we just lost contact with it. It's our fault. We have to get back. I haven't answered your question.
My understanding is that the big game in Korea right now, the big e-sport, is StarCraft.
Yep.
And I was curious if you had any insight as to why it was that particular game and not another one.
So the short answer was that there was the distributor of that product in Korea invested heavily in television coverage to help promote it. And it basically built the idea of the sport as a result. They also have a few just remarkable characters that play. And so you watch for the entertainment value. It is America's Idol. You watch the fools, you watch the guys you want to cheer for. It very much built up who those individuals are. And it's why it hasn't evolved to be anything else, is those players aren't relevant in another game. So it hasn't worked. As a result, it hasn't worked there. There have been attempts to make World of Warcraft that. There have been a few attempts to make Diablo that. Neither of them have really worked. We did FIFA that way. It didn't really work.
Does StarCraft 2 work?
Yes. Short answer is yes. because it's essentially the same game. Yes, sir.
You've spoken at great length about widening the pool of games that we're producing. How do you widen the pool of differentiating game designers? Since I'm assuming most of us in this room, we all grew up with the NES or the Sega Genesis or something like that.
Sure.
Playing very hardcore games. Where do we get the underrepresented populations coming in as game developers who say, I really want to make the next Angry Birds because that's
Go coach your girls soccer. I'm not kidding. It's go out and be in the real world with real people. So, for me, the rewards of this business are many, but the highlight for me, so I play ice hockey every Sunday morning at 6 a.m. It's an affliction, but I keep doing it. They're all mine, by the way. One of the highlights for me was when the guy who usually played goalie, I sat down in the locker room, he picked up his stuff and dragged it all the way across the locker room and I'm sitting there. Now, hockey goalie equipment weighs like 75 pounds. So you don't pick that stuff up and randomly wander around the room with it. You got a purpose. So he sat down and spent at least 15 minutes trying to understand how to stop his son's particular move he was doing to him in NHL. Things again, very important. But at the end of that conversation, what he said, for me and my kid, this is the same as playing catch in the backyard. For me, this game has become that. And so for me, what I thought was true is when I've taken a sport that I love, ice hockey, and I've turned it into essentially a dad and his son playing catch in the backyard, I think I made a little progress in life. That's a good day. I don't think I can handle it anymore. Thanks a lot, guys.
We hope you found this recorded session informative. If you are an established or aspiring game developer in the state of Georgia, we invite you to become a member of the GGDA in order to participate in our monthly networking and educational programs and to experience Siege firsthand. Information on becoming a member and attending chapter meetings can be found at ggda.org. Information on Siege can be found at siegecon.net. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll come back for the next episode of the Georgia Game Developers Official Podcast. Music for this program was provided by Professor Shy Guy. For the GGDA, I'm Thomas DeSadier.